Just a few months ago, many in the world, if they had heard we were planning an operation like the one in Kursk, would have said that it was unrealistic. That's Ukrainian President Zelensky in a statement just a few days ago, and he's right. Nobody really saw this coming. Nobody really thought Ukraine had the ability to conduct a cross-border operation into Russian territory and hold that ground for more than 2 weeks. So today we're going to take a look at how Ukraine was able to pull this off, how they're able to breach the Russian border and take now what is more than 1,250 square kilometers of territory. And we're going to break this into 3 sections. Arguably the most important we'll lead with operational security, or OPSEC. Second is intelligence gathering and preparation. And then third, TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. So starting with operational security, which is essentially not letting the enemy, or really anybody that doesn't need to know, about your plans for an operation before it takes place, right? OPSEC. So looking at an article here from The Economist titled, Russia's Double Punchback Against Ukraine's Shock Raid. This article will be linked in the description below, as will the link to the map that we're going to use today, Syriac map, publicly available resource. Zoom out here to give you a full look at Ukraine, and the area we're going to be looking at today is here in Kursk. They say several scenarios were considered for an offensive push at the weakest points in the Russian line. A strike in Bryansk region in the north, a strike in Kursk region, a combination of the two, or more. So again, we're looking at Kursk here. This blue area signifies the territory inside of Kursk, Russia, now occupied by Ukrainian forces. The red doesn't really need to be there, but it shows the general location of Russian forces. It's inside of Russia, so you got to expect that they're kind of everywhere. Now, zooming out a little bit, what they're talking about here is it wasn't just Kursk that was considered for this operation, but also Bryansk to the north. And we have seen previously cross-border raids and some minor fighting in recent days in Belgorod. But again, as of this recording, it looks like the only focus for Ukraine is this ongoing operation in Kursk. They say General Syrskyi, the overall commander of the Ukrainian military, kept his plans under wraps, sharing them only with a tight group of generals and security officials. He spoke to the president on a one-on-one basis without his staff. That is a very small group for a senior general like that to be going one-on-one with the president. Shows how serious they were taking the operational security around this mission. They say Western allies were also deliberately left in the dark. Syrskyi had 2 previous operations undermined by the West. One was leaked to the Russians, and on another occasion, we were instructed to abort. Limiting communications to a need-to-know basis enabled the Ukrainians to launch their attack before the Russians grasped what was happening. Now, I'll link, again, that article in the description because it goes into a lot more detail about how the soldiers, even being moved to Sumy ahead of this operation, had no idea what was going on until like a day or 2 prior. In fact, they thought their commanders were joking when they were briefed on, moving into Russian territory. So OPSEC across the board is really good. It's not clear to me what mission in the past had been leaked to the Russians. Maybe I'm just missing that. But either way, when Ukraine carried out their summer offensive down here in the south and somewhat in the east of Ukraine in 2023, that was telegraphed well ahead of time. And there were a variety of reasons for that. There were some political considerations, but what that led to was Russia had the ability to dig significant fortifications and reinforce much of this line. So when Ukraine did eventually attack in the locations that most people kind of expected it, they went up against a very significant, very deadly defensive line. So Ukraine learning from that, keeping a pretty tight lid on the Kursk planning. So tight that they didn't apparently even include the Americans in any of those plans. Now shifting over to the second piece here around intelligence gathering and preparation. Now there's a couple different pieces to this. We do have Ukraine gathering their own intelligence, kind of preparing for where they're going to carry out this operation, but also Russia ignoring their own. And that combination kind of created a perfect storm here in Kursk. Now, there's an article that came out recently interviewing a former Russian reconnaissance group commander, giving his assessment of how this played out in Kursk. I'll link that in the description below as well. I'd say take it with a grain of salt, nameless, anonymous source, but it does bring up some interesting points that I think are that do certainly apply here. He says, for more than 6 months, the Ukrainians, carried out reconnaissance operations. They kept coming in. There were some small skirmishes. Sometimes they got killed, sometimes not. But the main thing is they conducted additional reconnaissance, mapped out the area, tested the forces, and what changed on our side in 6 months? Fucking nothing. And then all of these raids in Kursk direction started. So these previous raids that we've seen carried out in places like Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod were mostly carried out by groups affiliated with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, but not necessarily conventional Ukrainian military units. These are groups like the Russian Volunteer Corps, the Freedom of Russia Legion, the Siberian Legion, and others. By and large, those cross-border raids took place, 2 to 4 days, maybe. Those groups regularly would suffer casualties. They'd take some Russian prisoners, destroy a few pieces of equipment, and then come back into Ukrainian territory. What this Russian commander is hinting at is those weren't just PR stunts designed to increase the morale of the Ukrainian citizens and have some good videos out to make Putin look bad. Every single one of those was gathering intelligence. And it wasn't just a matter of finding the weak points, be it Belgorod, Kursk, or Bryansk, but also identifying how the Russian military and Russian government as a whole responds when there is a threat on their own soil. And just based off of how things went in Kursk, it does look like Ukraine learned a lot from that. Additionally, last fall, Ukraine's National Resistance Center said that reconnaissance had showed that almost all of the strongholds are deserted of personnel and equipment along the border with Kursk, adding that corruption was a factor. So a couple different plans there. You have people moving into some of these border towns to identify weaknesses in the Russian lines, but then also the Ukrainian intelligence saying that a lot of the Kursk border region was under-equipped and understaffed. So it did look like Kursk was the right place, but Ukraine didn't have nearly enough soldiers to be able to pull off any sort of serious offensive in this region. For that, they'd have to pull in quite a few additional troops, and that's risky. With how much surveillance there is on the modern battlefield, it's not like you can just redeploy a couple thousand troops from one location to another along with their equipment and go unnoticed. So the way Ukraine got around that is kind of moving these units in piecemeal, little by little, rather than one entire brigade being pulled off the front. If you look at the patch chart of who's being deployed right now in Kursk, from what we can tell, it's kind of elements of a ton of different units. So it appears that one of the ways Ukraine was able to avoid this buildup being detected by the Russians is they didn't move a single brigade over there, or 4 or 5 brigades at a time. It was battalions and companies that showed up and kind of massed again under this guise of protecting Sumy from a Russian advance. Now, in that comment there by General Syrskyi, he talked about moving some of their battle-hardened divisions into this area, and that's something that's easy to look past, but it's in stark contrast to how Ukraine carried out their 2023 summer offensive in the southern portion of the country. One of the major criticisms of that operation was that many of the units that led the initial push were newly formed and recently trained on Western equipment. As in, for some of those Ukrainian soldiers, their introduction to combat was a complex assault against one of the most fortified positions in Europe since World War II. I mean, you can see how that might go poorly. And it looks like one of the lessons learned here is Ukraine leading some of these assaults with some of their more combat-hardened veterans. That whole thing is much easier said than done. When you have an experienced military unit during an active war, you want them everywhere, right? You don't want to replace an experienced unit with a less experienced unit, generally anywhere along the front. So you do have to make some sort of sacrifice if you're going to take those combat veterans, experienced combat veterans, and move them into some sort of offensive operation like Kursk. It is taking a risk elsewhere, and as we've seen in recent days and weeks, it looks like that risk is being assumed in the east and south of Ukraine, where Russia continues to make advances, specifically near Toretsk and Pokrovsk. But to achieve this overall level of surprise, Ukraine would need a little bit of help from the Russians. Moving to a Reuters article here that quoted Johann Michael, a research fellow at the IESD Institute in Lyon. He said, quote, "The Russians had a complete intelligence failure here," talking about the Ukrainian push into Kursk, adding that a Russian member of parliament and former military officer Andrei Gurilov said in a television interview 2 days after the incursion that Russian military leaders had been warned in a report about a month beforehand that there were signs of preparations of a Ukrainian attack, but nothing was done. Now, there are a lot of reports, rumors, I should say, at this point, that the Russian military was aware that something was going on in Sumy across from Kursk, but they didn't think that Ukraine had the ability to conduct an attack, or they kind of bought into that narrative that Ukraine was just beefing up their defenses in case Russia came across the border. The reason I say that it's really just a rumor at this point is because confirmation would require that somebody inside of the Russian government raises their hand and says, I had that information, I was briefed that there was going to be an attack, and I decided to do nothing. And that's not going to happen. So again, at this point, it's a lot of sources all reporting essentially what are rumors. But it makes sense based off of the Russian response in the opening days and really week in Kursk. Shifting over to the third piece here, TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures that have been adapted on both sides, starting with speed and mobility of the Ukrainian forces. Again, moving to the Russian commander, prior Russian commander talking about this. He says Ukraine planned everything smartly, like straight out of a textbook. conduct additional reconnaissance, chart the route, and most importantly, do it quickly. They arrived in groups and just started pushing forward without securing positions, just further and further, one swift push, because if they were to secure positions, it would give us time and opportunities to bring in troops to stop them. They say while Russian forces were gathering, Ukraine had already broken through. For instance, they penetrated, let's say, 15 kilometers. Meanwhile, the sabotage and reconnaissance groups go even further and start digging in. And when the Russian troops finally show up, the sabotage and reconnaissance groups start attacking them. Now, this is very similar in a lot of ways to what we saw in Kharkiv in 2022. And I'll pull the map up here to show you that area. This was a major Ukrainian offensive that really started because Ukraine, this blue area here on the map, light blue, was all occupied by Russia in the fall of 2022. And then a Ukrainian offensive essentially found a couple gaps in the line where the Russian positions were understaffed, under-equipped. They pushed through. It started falling back rapidly. It was kind of a domino effect. And next thing you know, Ukraine had liberated a massive chunk of territory in the northeast. That's a little bit like what we saw in the opening days in Kursk. And one of the reasons for that very well might be that a lot of the people defending the border in the Kursk region were conscripts. So again, Russia has a couple different types of soldiers in their ranks. They have contract soldiers, people who, for any number of reasons, voluntarily signed up to fight with the Russian military, often in Ukraine. And then you have conscripts, people that did not volunteer. They were ordered, they were drafted, they were conscripted into military service for a period of time. Those are ones that are, by law, having to serve inside of Russia and not in a combat zone, although Russia kind of skirts that at times. But the border guards in the Kursk region were almost all conscripts. They tend to be under-equipped, under-trained, and not always as interested in fighting as you might see from contract soldiers. This relatively poor quality of conscript soldiers is something that the Russian commander hit on as well, where he said, quote, "The conscripts don't know how to fight, and secondly, they don't have weapons to repel such attacks. If the Ukrainians were coming without equipment or just 2 tanks, you might still try to fight back. But when there are dozens of pieces of equipment, there's nothing they can do. What are you going to do with a machine gun against a tank?" So they let them all through because they simply had no way to stop them. Now, we should note at this point that the exact number of Russian POWs taken by Ukraine is not confirmed. I've seen credible reports suggesting over 300 at this point, and it's likely that most of those are conscripts who didn't have the means and or desire to fight back, and the Ukrainians just overran their positions during the opening hours of this operation. In this case, though, it wasn't just speed. Ukraine actually came prepared with additional equipment based on past experiences. Turning to Pasi Proinin, an analyst with the Blackbird Group, quoted in a recent article, he said the opening hours and days of this operation showed Ukraine using mine-clearing line charges, blowing paths through minefields, so essentially a rope of C4 clearing a lane for either personnel or vehicles to move through, dozer blades added on top of armored vehicles to clear paths through the Dragon's Teeth, and then bringing bridging vehicles in across ditches and small rivers. So those Dragon's Teeth are the triangle shapes on the ground. They can, if you just approach it with a regular vehicle, it can stop even a tank or any sort of wheeled vehicle. But when you put the right type of dozer blades on, you can just move them aside. And Ukraine was doing that right at the start of this operation. These are lessons taken directly from the 2023 Ukrainian summer offensive. Now they're surging engineering equipment forward to clear these gaps or bridge over obstacles without forcing the maneuver elements to stop hardly at all. It allows them to continue advancing at a pretty rapid pace. Now, in the south and the east of Ukraine, even right now, these are getting destroyed by Russian aircraft, artillery, ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, and FPV-style drones. However, in Kursk, Russia didn't have that same quantity of munitions, which allowed Ukraine to carry out this assault with engineering equipment in essentially a textbook manner. Now, while Russia didn't have the same quantity of munitions in Kursk, it wouldn't take long for them to redeploy air power to that region. Helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and or drones, but Ukraine had answers for all of those as well. According to that Reuters article, they say Ukraine deployed powerful electronic warfare equipment to hamper Russian communications and remotely mined key roads along which the Russians would likely send reinforcements. Now, electronic warfare can be jamming, spoofing, anything like that, was and can be used to prevent the use of Russian drones. And Ukraine kind of masked these FPV-style drones as a form of close air support in the opening days of the Kursk operation. They were hammering Russian positions ahead of the eventual assault, and Ukraine was even using some of these FPVs as a form of air defense, essentially targeting, and it looks like, successfully shooting down at least one Russian helicopter. But of course, a major concern for Ukraine is the Russian Air Force, VKS, the fixed-wing platforms, especially those that are dropping glide bombs. These are big bombs, 500,000, 1,500, even 2,000 kilogram bombs with a guidance kit attached and wings, so it can glide from a distance some 40, 50, 60 kilometers away from the target. What that means is that Russian aircraft are able to drop these outside of the range of short and medium range air defense assets, and they've been hammering Ukrainian lines in the east and south for a while. Now, we have started to see more glide bombs used in Kursk, but there were very, very few in the opening days, even week, of the Kursk operation, and that might be because of a specific strike that Ukraine carried out inside of Russia. On August 9th, just 3 days into the incursion, Ukraine hit Lipetsk Air Base, about 140 miles northeast of Kursk, destroying its ammunition dump and hundreds of glide bombs, cheap but relatively accurate long-range weapons that have hammered Ukrainian positions in the past few months. Even according to Rybar, Russian media, they say one of the strikes hit an ammunition depot. Residents of nearby villages were briefly evacuated and 9 people were injured. According to preliminary data, the planes managed to escape the attack. So, sure, would have been good to hit the planes, but I think there's a lot of focus on the planes at the time of that reporting. But what ended up coming out of that was the glide bombs impacting Ukrainian forces in Kursk were close to non-existent for, again, the opening hours, days, arguably even the first week that they were operating there. Now, again, we have started to see the arrival of these bombs in Kursk, but what the strike in Lipetsk did was to give Ukraine time to continue their advance. If Russia had their expected level of air power available to them in the first 24, 48, 72 hours of the operation, there's little chance that Ukraine would have been able to advance to where they are today. And that was all done through the combination of surging short and medium range air defense assets forward, bringing forward significant electronic warfare equipment, using drones to shoot down enemy helicopters, and then conducting a long-range attack to at least reduce temporarily the Russian stockpile of glide bombs. Now, still too early to determine how the Kursk operation will play out, but it is pretty clear at this point, through tightened OPSEC, intricate planning, and implementing lessons learned from previous battles, Ukraine was able to catch Russia off guard in a way that very few thought possible at this point in the war. But that's all I got for now. Of course, you can find links to all of the sources used in this video in the description below, as well as a link to our reader-funded research publication titled Between the Lines. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.